I apologize for my face. I forgot that I had this on my face until just now. I was reminded, so I hope you can forgive me. The person whose claim I am refuting was Lisa. Her refutation topic was extend the U.S. court system. Her main claim that I'm responding to is U.S. policy of terror detainees harms the goal of democracy. My opponent's secondary claims are the U.S. keeps detainees without regard for human rights. Her second one is the U.S. model is imitated by Middle East regimes. Her third one is nations return to operating without democratic reform because of U.S. policy. Her secondary claim one is the U.S. keeps detainees without regard to human rights. This argument is a vague claim without any specific evidence offered. There was no background information about the CNN documentary mentioned in her speech. There was no bib citation. How do we know that the 90% were wrongfully accused, as mentioned in her speech? She offers no proof that they don't have a failed trial, or mentioned what happened to them after we found out that they were wrongfully accused. How did we find out the information and what happened after? The Geneva Convention doesn't mention a trial for prisoners of war. According to Common Article 3 of the Geneva Convention, persons taking no active part in hostilities are only given trial if they might be executed. The current debate on the Geneva Convention is the requirement that soldiers wear uniforms, carry weapons openly, and have an identified leader in order to be considered prisoners of war. Her argument states that detainees are being held without the regard to the Geneva Convention. However, the prisoners I think that she's talking about aren't in uniform, and they are considered guerrilla soldiers. They aren't fighting for a country, they're fighting for a terrorist group. The term combat zone is not a vague term, as she mentions in her speech. According to the Department of Defense glossary, a combat area is a restricted area, air, land, or sea, that's established to prevent or minimize mutual interference between friendly forces engaged in combat operations. A combat zone is defined as an area required by combat forces to conduct operations. She says that we have an unfair advantage as a country detaining them, but she never explains what this advantage is. There is no proof of an advantage that we have there or that we're getting. Her secondary claim is the U.S. model is imitated by Middle East regimes. Saudi Arabia is a kingdom. Many of the other Arabian states are emirates. Iran is a theocratic dictatorship, and Iraq was a military dictatorship. The U.S. is none of those things. They are not imitating us. There is no evidence of this to be able to stand. During World War I and World War II, the U.S. there was a sedition laws that were upheld by the Supreme Court that puts limits on free speech. So her claim of they're not getting free speech isn't really, there's no evidence to support that because everyone was limited for free speech, even in the U.S. Military control in Iraq is not the same as a democracy. Now that we have left Iraq, there is a new government. The basic element of democracy is choice, which is why Iraq chose their government. Secondary claim 3, where nations return to operating without democratic reform because of U.S. policy. To convert a country to democracy, you have to introduce the right to vote, not habeas corpus, which is mentioned in the speech. Her statement that we put people sympathetic to our interests in their interim government is probably correct. However, Iraq's permanent government was chosen by election in Iraq by them, not by us, so her argument cannot stand. In conclusion, the premise of her argument is flawed. The U.S. court system cannot be extended into other countries, which is exactly what her topic is called. She makes various claims of the rights of citizens in other countries in relation to the U.S. Constitution. However, the U.S. Constitution only applies to the U.S., not other countries. The psychological study she refers to at the end has nothing to do with her claim because learning styles has nothing to do with democracy. It has to do with education. And the premise is flawed. Her evidence is vague and too flawed to support her claims. That is harming democracy in any way. Thank you.
All right, well, the issue's laid out pretty well. I do think that there are some times when you are just identifying what the points are without explaining what the inference was that the advocate was making on these particular points. So responding those points without telling us how your arguments are answering that doesn't always help. Even though we know what the point is, what the claim was, we need to know how that claim advanced or supported a conclusion that the advocate's presenting, and then why your argument undermines the way that conclusion is being reached. For example, you go through this whole thing about the Geneva Convention. I think the argument here is that the United States, by not subjecting these detainees to the Geneva Convention, in essence, is creating a model by which other countries might be able to treat prisoners poorly, or they don't have to follow civilized rules or something along those lines. I think that's the ultimate inference that the advocate's making here. Your argument seems to be that they don't meet the criteria for being prisoners of war. I think that's a good point to make. But what you also need to do is you need to tell us why that means that the consequence is that this is a unique situation and that it's unlikely that this would be modeled by anybody else outside of the context of these terrorist activities, for instance. All the stuff about the combat zone, I think you've got some good information on this, but it just seems to be responding to a point that the advocate presented without telling us why this is important. I mean, I'm not sure how it helps your position that we've got a definition of what a combat zone is, except that the advocate said something about combat zones. On the second point, I think that the same sort of thing. You basically are saying these countries are vastly different. The reason you ultimately are saying they are different is because the advocates seem to assume that they were changing in some way, and that change is not going to occur because they're going to model after our behavior. So you need to explain that to begin with, not just that the countries are different, but that why that difference matters to the argument. And I think you're kind of relying too much on us to make those inferences, and you need to make those inferences a little bit more. I thought you did a little bit better job on the third point. You do make a claim that says democracy is more affected by having the right to vote than it is habeas corpus. That's your assertion. I think that there could be a good way of demonstrating that. All the discussion about what Iraq has done subsequently, I'm not sure how that applies to the particular point that we're talking about. And again, I don't know how it's related to the issue of detainees. And so the notion that this is connected to the way we treat our detainees is not clear at all. You are responding to the points, but you're not explaining why your responses undermine the ultimate argument as clearly as you should. All right, thank you.